Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second podcast. We have Professor Asha Rangappa here with us today, and we're looking forward to discussing law enforcement, the current political environment, and career advice. But before we begin, I'm going to read a quick bio and then we can jump right into the questions. Asha Rangappa is an assistant dean and senior lecturer at the Yale University's Jackson School of Global Affairs and a former associate dean at Yale Law School. Prior to her current position, Asha served as a special agent in the New York division of the FBI, specializing in counterintelligence investigations. At Yale, she teaches courses on national security law, Russian information warfare, and leadership and ethics. She's the author of The Freedom Academy, an online Substack publication about disinformation and its impact on democracy. Asha graduated cum laude from the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University and was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to study constitutional reform and U.S. drug policy in Bogota, Colombia. She received her law degree from Yale Law School, where she was a Coker Fellow in Constitutional Law and served as a law clerk to the Honorable Juan R. Torwea on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit in San Juan, Puerto Rico. She is a legal contributor for ABC News and editor for Just Security, a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and a security fellow with the Truman National Security Project. Professor Rangappa, thank you so much for joining us today. If it's okay with you, let's dive into our first question.
Sounds great.
So first, about your academic background. You studied at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, was awarded a Fulbright to focus on constitutional reform, and then studied at Yale. Can you please share why you chose the concentrations that you did?
Yes, I feel like at every step I was informed by, something I had done before. So when I got to Princeton, I had taken 4 years of Spanish in high school. I went to a public high school, which basically offered Spanish and French. I think Latin too. It wasn't a huge array of languages. So, I had taken Spanish. I knew I wanted to continue to take it because I thought speaking another language was important. And so that led to my doing the Latin American Studies concentration because I thought, hey, if I'm taking all of these courses anyway, let me get this certificate in Latin American Studies. That led me to look for an internship one summer at the State Department where I worked at the Colombia desk. And then that got me interested in Colombia and what was going on there. And my senior year in college, I ended up applying for a Fulbright. So it wasn't that I had some grand, 5 year or 10-year plan. I think always kept a pulse on what I was interested in and then looked for the next opportunity to develop that interest.
And when we're relating that then to your career in law, and specifically like studying law, and you served as a clerk in the Court of Appeals, can you kind of share why you feel that law was so important to you and how working within the judiciary informs your perspective?
Yeah, so I was always interested in law going back to high school. I did moot court competitions when I was in high school. And I kind of always knew that I would apply to law school. I wanted to be a prosecutor. This idea of putting away the bad guys really appealed to me. So I went to law school, and one of the things in law school is that there's sort of a very well-trodden path. You go to law school and you ideally, get a clerkship for a judge, and then most people go on to law firms. And so once again, I was really looking at that path and thinking like, which of these pieces works for me and is in line with my interests. And so I did want to clerk. I thought that was a good opportunity, but I ended up clerking in San Juan, Puerto Rico, where most people don't go. And again, this kind of connects back to my interest in, Spanish speaking areas and, wanting to continue that thread. And then, I just decided to follow a little bit of a different path in terms of trying to get into a U.S. attorney's office. So rather than going to a law firm, I decided to apply to the FBI.
And kind of leading right into that, when you were in the FBI, you focused on counterintelligence investigations. So, kind of more specifically about the FBI, what motivated you to work in law enforcement?
So the initial motivation was what I just noted. Like, I thought that it was going to be a workaround to becoming a federal prosecutor. I
Mm-hmm.
thought that there wasn't any better experience. I mean, federal prosecutors work very closely with FBI agents, right? So I thought I will help do investigations on the investigative side. Once I do that for 3 or 5 years, then I'll become a U.S. attorney or assistant U.S. attorney. It was sort of like Law and Order, except I would do order and then the law, So to me, this made total sense. What happened though was that 9/11 happened during my clerkship. So though I had already applied to the FBI's priorities changed. So when I got in and I was one of their, candidates right after 9/11 because they started prioritizing different skills like speaking foreign languages. So, the Spanish, and also I speak an Indian language called Kannada, all of that helped kind of propel my application to the top. And once I got into the FBI, I wasn't doing criminal investigations. I wasn't kicking down doors, which is what I thought I would be doing. Their priorities changed. And so I ended up in the counterintelligence division, which is basically catching spies. It's the FBI monitors foreign intelligence presence in the United States. And that's what I was doing.
Okay, so then kind of now having left the FBI, I'm kind of wondering about your assessment of the current threat environment then. So like based on the threats and topics that you saw at the FBI, do you see similarities to the issues and threats that our country and the whole world face today?
A little bit, but it has changed a lot. When I was in the Bureau, again, in the counterintelligence division, China was a counterintelligence threat, a top counterintelligence threat. I think it was being pursued, but perhaps not as aggressively as maybe we should have been, because I think that is definitely now an acute threat in terms of stealing economic secrets,
Hmm.
espionage, cyber espionage, all hybrid warfare, all of those things. But I will say that that's a commonality between even 20 years ago. Like the FBI totally knew where this was going. I think what's different now than 20 years ago is, again, I went in right after 9/11. So the focus was so much on preventing another 9/11.
Hmm.
And that became, I think, almost a myopic focus. And I think a good focus because the FBI got really good at investigating terrorism, international terrorism, sharing information with other intelligence agencies, sharing intelligence with, our international partners and all of that. But I think in that focus, we lost sight of the threat coming from Russia. We were in the post Cold War. There was this assumption that, Russia's not a threat anymore. And I think we really dropped the ball on that. I think also, although there has always been domestic terrorism investigations in the FBI, I don't think that the FBI ever appreciated, that we could get to a point where we are now, where that is a huge threat for us in terms of our internal democracy and things like that. So those are some of the similarities and differences that I see.
Yeah, and kind of what you just mentioned about domestic terrorism, the internet obviously adds a whole different layer to that. So, like in the media, including your social media, you share your perspective on both domestic and global threats. In what ways would you advise, like my generation, to begin processing these issues? And equally important, what role and obligation do we have to be part of the solution and address these challenges?
Yeah, those are really big questions, and I'm
I
not sure I
know.
can answer both adequately. But I would say that your generation is probably I think the first one that was really socialized completely, through the internet. Like in other words, you grew up with that. It was, the internet came along when I was like leaving college, and even I think millennials, things like social media and um, those kinds of platforms came later. But you all have kind of grown up with this, and I think one benefit of that is that you've been acclimated to it in an environment where we now appreciate the negative externalities of these technologies and how dangerous they can be, how they can be weaponized. And so I am hopeful that there's going to be more of a shift in understanding our relationship with social media, with technology, and maybe even a pendulum swing to almost treat it like a public health crisis, like the way that we treated tobacco in the 90s, where there becomes more of an awareness and a shift of, look, this is fine in moderation, but it has some really dangerous effects, and we need to pull back a little bit and become more engaged in real life with each other, as a way of kind of repairing our social fabric, which I think is really fragmented right now and a huge vulnerability in terms of our democracy.
Mm-hmm. And kind of shifting gears here a little bit then towards career advice. As a woman, but also a woman of color who focused on law and law enforcement, can you share any challenges that you faced?
Yeah, sure. I mean, going into the FBI, which even today is a predominantly white male dominated agency,
Mm.
despite their efforts to really recruit, I just think there's a lot of self-selection, um, especially from, community like immigrant communities, South Asian communities. The law enforcement just isn't like a real path that people think about. Um, so there are a lot of challenges when you are one of the few people kind of trying to break through those barriers. And what I would say is that, the people that are on the front ends of those types of waves, you have to just look at the challenges and recognize that there are definitely people around who want to help you. That's what I learned. And seek out mentors, seek out, you know, people who will support you. That's kind of how I managed the challenges that were there. And, I think looking back, some of those people are still my closest contacts.
Mhm. And this question's kind of very similar to what you just mentioned, but if you have anything different maybe that you might wanna add to people who are interested in public affairs and the law, is that the same kind of advice you think you would give is, like, finding mentors in that space to really help you out?
Yeah, well, public affairs in the law is a much, I think, broader field than, say, law enforcement. So I think it really depends on what specific path you want to take in that arena, on what challenges you'll face as, being underrepresented. But yeah, I think really in any path, finding good mentors is so key. And I think often we think of mentors as being people in high positions, or like they're I think we have a very narrow idea often, and the best definition that I heard of a mentor is anyone whose hindsight can be your foresight.
Hmm.
And that really broadens the aperture and can bring in people from all different areas of your life who can be a resource for you. You don't have to feel like it has to be that professor or like that boss. Um, Anyone whose hindsight can be your foresight can be someone who can guide you.
Right. That's I like that saying.
Hmm.
And kind of this is another broad-ish question, but there are so many critical topics that we will have to help address, like geopolitical challenges, respect for the rule of law, personal freedom, sustainability, access to the ballot box, all of those things. So how would you advise that my generation go about prioritizing and tackling these, especially for those of us who are still in high school and college?
That's a great question. I think one thing that I've seen with um, students and younger people, on the one hand, there's this amazing global concern, awareness of all these different challenges that you mentioned, which I think is fantastic, because you need that awareness to effect change. I think the flip side of that is maybe this overwhelming sense of responsibility for each person that they need to fix everything. And that can, I think, lead to burnout and apathy. So, what I would say is when you look at kind of all of these pressing challenges and things that, get you down, you feel like you need to fix, take that passion and focus on the one thing that you know, that motivates you and that you can really impact even in your small corner of the earth, and maybe trust that there are other people who are taking on the mantle for these other things, and that collectively you're going to make a difference, rather than feeling like you need to like solve every single problem and take on every cause, and
Right.
because I don't think that that makes anyone that effective or touches um the full potential of what they could do.
Right. Yeah, so find that broader community and kind of collectively going at it together.
Mhm.
And that's kind of a perfect segue to my next question. At Yale's Jackson School of Global Affairs, you're discussing the American elections this year, as well as other elections around the world, including in India, Argentina, and other democracies. So, where do you kind of see glimmers of hope, or kind of like what you were talking about with community, and what are the major concerns that you have?
Yeah, I'm gonna leave the glimmer of hope piece to the side because the jury is still out for me on that. But I do think that we're at an inflection point globally where, because of the technology and social media that we've seen, there is a shift in the balance of power that allows um, people who I think have anti-democratic designs to have a lot of influence and power.
Right.
And so what I think we see in a lot of elections, including our own, is we are really facing a choice between democracy and autocracy. That's what I think it is. And autocracy has won in a lot of places. And it will take a very coordinated effort that crosses political differences, policy differences, to really, in my opinion, mount an effective challenge to defeat that trend.
Hmm.
Like, to me, this is not the time to care about what political label you have, or who how you're registered. It's really, to me, a values-based issue. Like, who shares your values, these ground
Right.
rules, like democracy, and if they are from a different political party or it doesn't matter right now.
Yeah.
You can go back to debating those things like once we're back to normal.
Right. Right. So specifically about U.S. elections, then we're recording this just a few days after Super Tuesday, and the presumptive nominees for both parties are President Biden and former President Trump. So, given your focus on misinformation and disinformation in this election cycle, how can we kind of separate fact from fiction? And is there a role we can play this year specifically in keeping a focus on the facts and values, like you just mentioned?
Yes, I think we have to become our own curators of reliable information. I personally have had to, temper. Well, let me start. We have to curate our own information. So I think, being aware of where you're getting your information, what biases there are there, um, and how you're evaluating it. It's going to require some mindfulness on that part. The
Mhm.
other thing is that I have become more cognizant of how disinformation and even just, political discussions generally really manipulate us emotionally, especially on social media. So I have found that I've needed to just unplug for long periods of time from like scrolling news feeds, because even if it's stuff that like I agree with, or even if it's coming from reliable sources, it can generate a lot of anxiety and anger, and emotional reactivity. None of those things are, I think, super healthy. Like, there's some of that that's healthy to get you mobilized and motivated, but then you need to like unplug and then go do something.
Right.
Yeah.
So then, do you think, are there programs at Yale or elsewhere which you think are good examples of engaging and mobilizing young people to be in public discourse while, like you just mentioned, the anxiety piece of it, and making sure that it kind of turns into an action, but it's not overwhelming. So are there examples where you see this working and making a difference?
Um, yeah, I mean, I don't know of like, necessarily organizations at Yale, but I mean, I know with my own students, especially the ones who take my information warfare class, I know that they translate that into, meaningful actions. So, I think it really happens at the individual level.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. We appreciate your insight and your time.
Thank you so much for having me.